Hi everyone, my name is Karen Brewster. I'm a Master Gardener with the Penn State Extension Center County Master Gardeners. Today we are going to be talking about container gardening. When you begin to plan for your container garden, there are three things to be mindful about. The first is to allow room to grow for your plants. You don't want to overplant your container garden. The second is to use the right kind of soil. And the third item is to allow for proper drainage in your container garden. Using the right kind of soil is very important. You will often see in a store varieties of soil that you can purchase. The first would be topsoil, the second is garden soil, and then the third is usually a potting mix. And of those three types of soil, you will want to choose the potting mix. The potting mix usually has some peat moss, some perlite mixed in with it that help to keep the soil from packing and allow for good drainage for your container garden. You want to ensure that the container that you use has adequate drainage. You might want to be sure that the container has holes in the bottom of the planter. If you're planting a larger container, you may want to include a layer of gravel in the bottom of your container. And then you want to avoid placing saucers underneath your outdoor pots. Those saucers can fill with water and cause the roots of your plants to rot, which is something that is not good. When you put together your container garden, there is a technique called thrill, fill, and spill. And using this technique will give your container garden a really nice design element, a little bit of flair. The first element is the thrill element, and you can see in this slide that they have used some tall grasses. That's usually the focal point of your container garden, and many times you can use a perennial type grass as the thrill factor in your container garden. The second element is the fill element, and that is a smaller compact type of flower that you might want to include to fill in the spaces at the base of the tall plant that you use. And then the third factor is the spill factor, and those are the very pretty plants that drape over the edge of your container and kind of draw your eye down. Your container garden will need fertilizer throughout the growing season. If you used a potting mix, many of those potting mixes do include fertilizer in them. If that is the case, then you do not want to over fertilize by adding fertilizer to that mix. If you are unsure whether or not your potting mix has fertilizer in it, you can always add just a little bit of a healthy aged compost to your soil mix. That will ensure that your plants are getting the proper nutrients that they need for the growing season. We talked earlier about the importance of allowing space in your container gardens. You don't want to overplant. A crowded container garden will oftentimes not do well. When you're planting a large container garden, it can become very heavy because of the soil and the gravel. This slide shows you a little bit of a trick that you can use in not filling the full container, but inserting a smaller container inside the larger one. This particular slide uses plastic bottles, which really have very little weight, to fill most of the large container, and then they are sitting the smaller container on top of the larger bottle, the larger pot in the bottles to create a light planter, which makes it easier to move around if you want to move your container garden. Again, you want to keep your container gardens watered, but you do not want to overwater. And one method that you can use to try and avoid overwatering is using a plastic water bottle. You can punch holes in the side of the bottle, bury the bottle in your planter, and that bottle, once filled with water, will slowly release water over a period of time. and keep your plants watered during the very hot months of summer. This slide shows some very pretty flowers, annuals that provide a real punch of color that makes a very visually appealing container garden. You can see here that we have some of the kale and pansies for the cool weather, and then we move into some of the brighter colors for summer, the coleus and zinnias, some cosmos there as well. Another plant that can be included in a container garden that does extremely well are perennials. Many times we don't think about using perennials in container gardens, but they do tend to do very well. You can also use evergreens or shrubbery in your container garden. That also creates a nice effect, gives lots of green color, some texture. Vegetables can be included in your container gardens. You'll see here in this slide that they have put a container filled with some tomatoes and cucumbers, a variety of vegetables, and makes for a very pretty, colorful kind of container garden. Herbs are another really nice way to fill a container. You can plant them in the spring and they will last long into the fall, and you can use the cuttings in your cooking. Once you have your container garden constructed, you can cover it with mulch. You can see here that there are acorns used in one of the planters, and I believe it's seashells that someone has also used. These kinds of coverings give the planter a decorative element, but they also aid in holding in moisture, which will be important for your container garden during the hot summer months. This slide shows how they have used several container gardens in a grouping to give a bigger impact. This particular image has some yellow pansies and violets with some yellow grasses. It makes for a very nice spring container garden. Hanging baskets can also be fun ways to do container gardening, and you'll see here they've used a lot of ferns. You can attract bees and butterflies with your container gardening if you use the appropriate kinds of flowers. And this can be a really fun project if you have children, to teach them about the importance of pollination and how the butterflies and the bees contribute to that. Sometimes some of the simplest container gardens are just a very simple container. And you can see in this image that they've used an old teapot or tea kettle to hold a beautiful red geranium. I often like in the spring months to visit yard sales and will look for really unique containers that I can plant with some really pretty flowers. When doing that, it's important to remember that you want to be sure the container has good drainage. Petunias and nasturtiums are very good flowers to use in container gardens. Maintaining balance is important in a container garden, but at the same time, some people prefer to not have balance, and that can also have a very nice visual impact. We show here a pyramid type arrangement. You can use that for vegetables and or flowers in your container garden. It's important to remember to keep the plants appropriate for the environment. If you have a container that is in full sun, it's very important to be sure that you use drought-resistant flowers to ensure that the container garden thrives during those hot summer months. If you use perennials in your container gardening at the end of the growing season, you can plant the perennials in another part of your garden versus using annuals. They're a one season plant. You discard them. Using perennials will allow you to add to your gardenscape. We talked earlier about the lifespan of a container garden. If you give great thought to your plantings, your container garden can last truly year-round. Using cool weather plants in the spring months, and then in the summer going to more heat-resistant type of plants, and then fall, amending your container garden to again include some cool weather plants. Winter gardens are, winter container gardens are often overlooked, but they're a very nice way to add some life and brightness to your winter patio or your porch. The red twig dogwood is a beautiful kind of evergreen, or I guess a bush to use. The twigs are very pretty. Using evergreens are also another nice touch. I've actually used thistle and winterberry as additions with the red twig dogwood. Makes a very nice winter container garden. These next few slides just show the inspiration that a container garden can have and the creativity that can be used when creating your container garden. Porch boxes are another great way to do container gardening. You'll see that this particular porch box is used using mainly green foliage plants, which is really very pretty. So when planting your container garden, we again want to remember that we need to use good soil. We don't want to overplant, and we want to ensure that our containers have appropriate drainage. In terms of the decorative or aspect or design of your container garden, you want to remember the thrill, fill, and spill technique. Most importantly, you want to have fun and enjoy putting together your container garden and then maintaining it throughout the growing season. If you have questions about container gardening or would like additional information on how to become a Penn State Master Gardener, please go to extension.psu.edu.